Hello, and welcome to this video panel. My name is Philipp Hirsch, and I'm with the Center for Geopolitics. Tonight, I'm delighted to chair this panel on Israel and the Gulf, a new chapter in Middle Eastern politics. Less than a year ago, Israel established diplomatic relations with two Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, and Bahrain. What is also known as the Abraham Accords was soon followed by further normalization of Israeli relations with Morocco and Sudan. It is worthwhile to remember that until last year, Israel had only been recognized officially by two states, Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994. And by two states, I obviously mean only two Arab states. So the Abraham Accords are clearly significant when looked at through the lens of the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. However, they also point to something more, the conflictual geopolitics of the Gulf. For years, if not decades, tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran have been rising, and the smaller Gulf states have been impacted by this as well, of course. Some have therefore viewed the Abraham Accords as heralding the formation of an Arab-Israeli alliance against Iran. Then again, this view might oversimplify the interest behind the Accords. The new US administration under President Biden seems intent to diffuse tensions in the region, but a clear policy for this has not emerged yet. In light of this, it is worthwhile to consider whether the Abraham Accords really represent a new chapter for the geopolitics of the Gulf, or whether they are just a logical continuation of previously existing trends. So in a way, new wine in old bottles, or old wine in new bottles rather. There are so many angles and dimensions to this question, and tonight we'll try to untangle some of them. For this purpose, we have a panel of three distinguished speakers with us tonight. Sanam Vakil is Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. John Raine is Senior Advisor at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS. And last but not least, from Berlin today, Sebastian Zunz is joining us. He's a researcher at the Center for Applied Research and Partnership with the Orient, or CARPO. And I want to thank all three of them already for joining us for this video panel tonight. Before we begin, I want to make some quick technical remarks as usual. After some introductory remarks by our speakers, we will discuss questions from you, the audience. For this, please submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions at any point in time, and I want to encourage you to bring in many of them so that our panelists can discuss them and they're keen to do so. I would just ask that you state your name and affiliation when submitting your questions. If your question is for a specific panelist, please make sure to state that at the outset as well. As always, this event is being recorded and will be made available on our website over the next few days. But that should be all for an introduction. Let's go right into our discussion. John, let's start with you. What would you say? Do you think would you go more on the side of saying that the Abraham Accords are a new chapter for Middle Eastern politics, or do you rather see them as a sort of overstated in their novelty?
Thanks, Philip. I do think that they are potentially marking a new era in Gulf security, potentially. I mean, at the moment, we have the accords and we have expressions of intent, but we haven't yet seen those translate into solid security arrangements. Although the long-standing security relations are well documented now between two countries, they're yet to translate, I think, into something really concrete. And I was just reflecting on how long it takes to build trusting defense and security relationships. They're not built overnight. Israel indeed knows that, not least from its experiences with Jordan and with Egypt. I think it's worth reflecting on the kind of Gulf security environment that Israel is now entering. And it might seem a bit strange that as the world pivots towards the Indo-Pacific, we're here this evening talking about the Gulf again. But the Gulf does seem to be in many ways, it's a kind of fulcrum around which you might make such a pivot to the Indo-Pacific, in that it's going to be of persistent, unchanging concern to regional players and of course to major external players. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is the sort of long-standing involvement and investment in the area by influential players, not least the US, but also an increasing number of other players. It's not just Israel who's now an actor in the Gulf, but Turkey is as well, through a military presence in Qatar, not least. India, Pakistan, China have all sought to establish interests, or indeed are part of security arrangements in the Gulf. So lots of countries are, as it were, looking in, investing in. You've also got, and this is a recent development which has changed the nature of Gulf security, you have Gulf states projecting out. And in particular, the projection of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who in this context, I think are the key players, both into the region and beyond, into North Africa and into East Africa, has shown a willingness, a determination to prosecute a very forward kind of defense policy. And I don't think that is going to change. But that, coupled with the number of countries investing in the region, leaves you with a highly internationalized security environment. And that's the environment into which Israel has entered. In turn, it's worth bearing in mind too what the nature of threats are to Gulf security, because this is also very relevant to how we contextualize Israel's entry. And I see it really as a region that faces an increasingly dense matrix of threats, which are layered onto one another. The determinant threat is still Iran, as the state level potential aggressor, as the persistently engaged adversary, both in the Gulf and in the broader Middle East. Iran is still kind of shaping defense policy. But in addition to that, Gulf states share with Israel the very complicated threats that are raised by, let's call them transnational movements. But radical transnational Islamist movements are very much a shared threat for the countries in the region and for Israel. And they represent, if you like, a category of threat which is notoriously difficult to contain. And even if you were to take Iran out of the equation, is going to constitute a persistent threat to the Gulf states. I'll also add into the list of threats, there's just the risk of contagion in the Gulf from those as yet unresolved conflicts in Yemen, in Syria and Iraq. And there is no reason why Gulf communities, Gulf societies should be immune from contagion from those conflicts or from an overspilling of agendas that are being prosecuted there, most notably by extremist movements. And then the threat that I think makes the arrival of Israel so interesting is the emerging asymmetric threat driven by asymmetric technologies. In some cases, I'm thinking particularly of UAVs and more widely available and more widely used methods of cyber attack, which mean that your ability to defend yourself relies upon quite a sophisticated defense ecosystem. And it's not now so much a case of having the hardware to defend yourself or the heavy metal as having the software and the techniques and the long-term commitment to research and deployment of new techniques, which is a kind of signature of the Israeli defense ecosystem and a point of real compatibility with the Emiratis certainly, and Bahrain's and the Saudis. So I think you've got this, if you like, persistent interest, I would predict, and vital interest in Gulf security, and this very complicated, layered matrix of threats that it faces. And then if we sort of look at the way in which Gulf states have responded to this, I think it's been, over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we've seen a combination of the habitual and the experimental. And the habitual is the reliance upon very well-established defense partners, which is buttressed by a lot of diplomatic and intelligence interface and an investment in those relationships which have served them well over the years. And even though that has its ups and downs, it's undoubtedly going through a period of tension now. So far, it's actually historically remarkably resilient. So that, if you like, that's the habitual part of it. The experimental part for me is the really interesting part, because this is where we have seen both Gulf states themselves and others who are in kind of forms of coalition with them, I'm thinking particularly Jordan and Egypt, experimenting both with new partnerships, with new deployments, with new ways of making security arrangements. This has been driven by that matrix of threats and a realization that they have interests in common here and an urgency which requires them to be more active and more forward in the defense policies than they have been before. And that includes extraterritorial offensive projection. But it also has required them to think innovatively about what constitutes defense in the current age. And that we can see clearly is in part enshrined in what they're trying to do in their reform of the economy and the labor force, which is to develop a civic drive to national defense, enriching national technical and intellectual capabilities, educational capabilities, as well as the purchasing of hardware and the equipment. So there's a lot of experimentation going on and innovation around what constitutes sensible defense in the Gulf. Now, I think that this has led, all of this has led to the emergence of it's a kind of security architecture. We've all been talking for decades about security architecture in the Gulf. It's always been notoriously hard to pull off in a kind of de jure treaty-based, organizational-based system. But actually, if we look at what's happening, we've got a de facto security architecture. It's a little bit more security than architecture. It's not that formalized, but you can see with this innovation, the experimentation with partnerships, blending it with the longer standing habitual approaches to defense. You can see that, you know, that the region is definitely reaching for something here. I think the big question is whether or not Israel is going to be an accelerant of that process, is going to give the region confidence to go for almost a strategic autonomy here. So the combination of Gulf capabilities plus Israel, is that enough actually to provide you with an integrated security architecture which has a regional reach, which means you could get by, or perhaps more than get by, even if the Americans pull back? And that brings me to the second issue here, where Israel is again relevant, is what role is there for the US in this emerging security arrangement? And the debate really, which we might touch on later in the US clearly, is, do we want to be part of anything formal in the Gulf? Do we want to retrench, or what? I would just close my comments by saying that if the US were not there in the region, something, and we have an inkling of what it will be, will emerge by way of a security arrangement, which could at some point become permanent security architecture. It will have an interesting list of both capabilities and of players. And I guess the question is, would we be happy with what we saw emerge? Would we, the US, the UK, France, would we actually really rather be involved and give that a shape which we're happy with?
Great, thank you so much. Sebastian, a key member of any sort of de facto security arrangement or architecture, as John just put it, would obviously also have to be Saudi Arabia, or presumably be of Saudi Arabia. Do you think that Saudi Arabia already sees itself as part of this? And what is their view on this whole new development around the Abraham Accords?
Thank you, first of all, Philip, for the invitation and for providing me the chance to talk about this very important and timely topic. So, of course, for Saudi Arabia, it's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. And so far, we haven't seen formal normalization yet between Saudi Arabia and Israel for several reasons. I will elaborate on that a little bit more in detail in a minute. But of course, coordination and dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Israel is not a new phenomenon per se. And there was for years a discrete exchange on security and intelligence issues. And of course, we have witnessed the meeting of Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Saudi Arabia in November. And at that time, there were speculations that formal normalization will be happening soon. But it did not. First of all, I would like to briefly explain what the Saudi interests and what the Saudi interest in Israel is at the moment on three levels, starting with the regional level. And also John has elaborated a little bit more on threat perceptions and on the perception to unite against specific enemies or rivals, and that is also true for Saudi Arabia and Israel, who that share a mutual threat perception, which is the common enemy Iran. In addition, also to what John said, extremist ideologies. So both agree on counterbalancing Iran's interventionist approach in the direct neighborhood of Saudi Arabia, such as in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and specifically in Yemen. And thus, a closer coordination from a Saudi perspective also aims to form a joint bulwark against Iran. And on the international level, closer cooperation with Israel aims to diversify Saudi Arabia's security partnerships. Of course, there is still the long-term strategic alliance with the United States going on, but we also witnessed the retrenchment from the US from the region to a larger or minor extent. And specifically now under the new President Joe Biden, the Saudi-US relations has come under strain. He has expressed his interest to recalibrate the US-Saudi relations by exerting more pressure on the Saudi leadership with regards to halting offensive military support in Yemen, for instance, or demanding the release of human rights activists. And another thorn in the Saudi side was, of course, the publication of the Khashoggi report a couple of weeks ago, accusing the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman again as directly involved in the murder of the journalist. And in addition, even under Trump, who was perceived as a strong supporter of MBS, the full-fledged military support was limited, and this was shown, for instance, in the aftermath of the attacks on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia back in 2019, when the US did not respond in direct favor of the Saudis against Iran. And this episode was an eye-opener for the Saudi leadership in order to foster security diversification and to reach out more intensively to other possible security partners such as Israel, but also China or Russia, for instance. And together with Israel and the UAE, Saudi Arabia also wants to gain more leverage on US-Iranian negotiation on Iran's nuclear program. And from their perspective, Biden needs to take their interest more closely into consideration by addressing Iran's regional interventionism and its ballistic missile program. The Saudi foreign minister called it a JCPOA++. And last but not least, on a domestic level, Saudi Arabia is in dire need of economic diversification by attracting more investment, not only from and trade with Israel, but also together with Israel. So Saudi Arabia's economy is facing tremendous challenges, not only due to the double shock, the decline in oil prices and the outbreak of COVID-19, but also due to structural challenges the oil-reliant economy in Saudi Arabia is facing for decades. So for instance, youth unemployment has increased to almost 30%, and that is an explosive issue domestically, and the Crown Prince, MBS, needs to deliver in terms of job creation in order to prevent more social frustration. And in this regard, Israel could and still is a relevant partner for boosting the Saudi economy. Furthermore, the pro-Palestinian narrative has lost credibility, specifically among parts of the younger Saudi generation, to which also MBS belongs to. Today, Palestine is mostly considered as a problem that needs to be managed and not to be solved, which is specifically true for parts of the younger generation that constitutes at least 70% of the generation of the society. But as I said in the beginning, formal normalization is not very likely in the foreseeable future, which is mainly due to two reasons, I would argue. So first, it's the Crown Prince father, King Salman. He is still a strong supporter of the Palestinian issue, and he represents the older, more traditional generation that feels more emotionally attached and also committed to the Palestinian conflict than younger Saudis. And as the custodian of the two holy shrines, also Saudi Arabia, represented by Salman, needs to show solidarity for the Palestinian brothers. And second, the Arab Peace Initiative that was initiated by late Saudi King Abdullah back in 2002 is still very, very relevant in the public and political discourse in Saudi Arabia. This initiative, and maybe we can elaborate more on that in the discussion, is of course saying that normalization is contingent on the resolution of Israel's conflict with the Palestinians, and it's based on the two-state solution. So against this backdrop, normalization with Israel is a much more sensitive issue for Saudi Arabia than for the UAE and Bahrain, as long as Salman is in power. But under a future king, Mohammed bin Salman, though, this discussion will most likely intensify again. But nevertheless, timing and framing always remain key when Saudi Arabia is taking strategic decisions. So the Saudis will consider very carefully when and under which circumstances they will foster normalization and what they can benefit out of it. So to close up, Israeli-Saudi relations will remain a balancing act for the Saudis, driven on the one hand by its willingness to foster cooperation, and on the other hand, by the sensitive character of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for the Saudi legitimacy.
Thank you so much. That was really that was a great rundown of the Saudi perspective, and indeed, sort of listening to you, I almost felt, why didn't the Saudis kick off the the normalization cascade? But it was firstly, you gave a good reasons why they didn't, and secondly, it's obviously it was the smaller Gulf states who went first on this. It was the Emirates. It was Bahrain. So Sanam, why was it that it was sort of from the smaller Gulf state that the initiative came? And also, do you think it has paid off for them so far and for their rationale behind normalizing relations?
Thank you, Philip, for the invitation and the Center for Geopolitics. Pleasure to add to this discussion alongside John and Sebastian, who I think have really outlined everything really effectively. I mean, specifically to answer your question, I think the smaller Gulf states have had, as Sebastian specifically spoke to, much more nimble ability to react compared to Saudi Arabia, for example, that is hampered by domestic and sort of broader regional concerns. More closely tied to the Palestinian issue, which remains a prominent generational issue. As mentioned, the Saudi king Salman feels quite connected to the Palestinian issue, whereas I think the younger generation of leaders in the smaller GCC states, of course, see the Palestinian issue as important, but not in the same way and weight that their forefathers or grandfathers did. So this is, in my reading, partly a generational shift. And as part of this generational shift, you have pragmatic, more transactional, national interest oriented leaders at the helm of these countries as well, that are looking to articulate a broader, more ambitious role for their individual countries in the region. And I see the UAE in particular as trying to take the lead in this process. It has had a very robust and activist foreign policy, and it sees itself as a role model for the broader Middle East, a role model that maybe can be counterbalanced to its neighbor and competitor, Qatar, where the Qataris, equally ambitious and also nimble, with huge wealth to add to it, have very differing visions for the region or for political governance in the region. And I think that understanding these different visions is really important to understanding the rift with Qatar that lasted for 3 years and was resolved in January of this year. But of course, there needs much more work to be invested in the rebuilding after that crisis, effectively. The Qataris have long seen the Muslim Brotherhood as a very reflective example of regional government, believing that political Islamic groups can be included in regional governments, and thereby they have over the past decades been supporting Muslim Brotherhood groups throughout the region, whereas the Emiratis have taken a completely counter position and approach, seeing, as John and Sebastian also said, seeing political Islamic groups as a sort of sliding scale to transnational terrorist organizations that can very much threaten the stability of the Emirati model, which is based on the idea that it's a secular, but of course, or authoritarian state. So understanding the ideological divide here, I think really remains important. And that shared threat perceptions and the shared values from the Emirati perspective, I think brings the two countries together quite uniquely, and brings them together also in their relationship with the United States. Both the UAE and the Israelis have, since the Obama administration, really experienced a number of frustrating moments with regards to the US, deeply concerned about US security commitments to the Middle East, recognizing that domestic opinion in the United States is very much shifting away from US military and security investments. We've heard the statements calling for a drawdown of forever wars. President Trump was very direct, despite sort of resurrecting the strong relationships with Israel and the Gulf states. He was also quite direct in calling for more burden sharing. There was not very direct or consistent policy responses with regards to regional threats stemming from Iran. So these anxieties, I think, really drove both Israel and the UAE to seize the opportunity and through normalization, I think, accomplish a few things. First of all, to remain relevant in Washington, and to use their mutual relationship as a, let's say, calling card of their regional importance, of their ability to cooperate regionally on these shared threat perceptions and shared values for the region. We know that American policymakers, at least the Democrats, very much respect value-oriented policies. So presenting themselves as value-driven also wins them some favors in Congress as well, and of course with the Biden administration. And at the same time, I think in preparation perhaps for the future where the US does make a more meaningful pivot to geopolitical threats in the Indo-Pacific, for example, these two could potentially, and I say could potentially because I think we're far away from that point just yet, but could potentially be regional influencers in absence of the Middle East and try to power broker a number of regional conflicts, manage transnational threats from Islamist groups or non-state actors sponsored by Iran. So I think there is a broader objective to the normalization, but I'm not so sure, and here I'm not as convinced as John is that we're on the precipice of a regional security architecture yet. I'm not so sure that we are there yet. Really, because, and I'm not so sure if that this will be effective. There's possibility for it to be effective, but this model will yet again impose a collective security architecture on the Middle East, and collective architectures bring countries together on mutual threat perceptions, but what they don't do are try to mediate and solve conflicts in a cooperative setting. And really what the Middle East is, I think, desperately lacking is a cooperative security arrangement. That sort of initiative has never really been achieved. All of the security arrangements that do exist in the Middle East are collective. This should be the sort of long-term agenda if the region, I think, is to manage a number of their conflicts more effectively. All of that to the side, let me also just make a comment. We have made mention of their shared threats, the Israelis and the Emiratis in particular, but and their shared threats, of course, vis-a-vis Iran, I think, are the most important of those threats. But they do have very different tactics for how they manage Iran in the region. And I think it's important to make mention of them. I mean, first of all, as Sebastian mentioned, both of the countries and all of the GCC have been lobbying the Biden administration alongside European and British policymakers to avoid a quick JCPOA reentry and to take a longer strategy towards lengthening and strengthening the JCPOA, with efforts ultimately at readdressing the regional issues that were not addressed in the 2015 deal. So, collectively and bilaterally, these countries have this similar agenda. But tactically on the ground, the way they have managed their threat perception is very different. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning that Israel, if you sort of look at the threats coming from Iran, Iran's nuclear program, Iran's ballistic missile program, Iran's support for proxy and militia groups around the region. You could also add its cyber capabilities to that as well. The Israelis very much see Iran's nuclear program as its principal threat, and quietly they would acknowledge that the JCPOA was effective. Of course, they would like to see longer deadlines and longer sunsets to the JCPOA, but they saw the nuclear constraints on Iran as being important for their security, and quite importantly, they have been quite effective in trying to manage Iran's creeping encroachment in Syria, for example. And so, it's important to look at Israel in one basket and the UAE conversely in another, that, and Saudi, I think you could also add, but there are also differences between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Both the UAE and Saudi Arabia see Iran's regional role as much more threatening. And when you break apart the regional role, if we sort of remember the instability in the Persian Gulf in 2019, the missile attacks on Saudi oil facilities in September of that year, I think elevated Iran's missile program above Iran's support for proxy groups as a principal regional threat. And so for the UAE, the missile program urgently needs to be addressed. And the way the UAE has tried to manage its tensions with Iran was specifically in 2019, they quietly de-escalated, opened a back channel with Tehran. Sheikh Tahnoun traveled to Tehran, and there was a sort of warming of relations. I wouldn't overstate the relationship by any means, but I think that shift suggests that there are more broader tools in the UAE's diplomacy toolkit, but they don't have the gray zone capacity to push back against Iran. And so thereby, they're still very much dependent on the United States. And I'm not so sure that the Israelis are going to necessarily be the answer, should the Iranians start sending more missiles over the Gulf, in the coming months, as there's JCPOA uncertainty. So I think it's important to think about those divergences. And finally, just quickly on the JCPOA, as we are moving towards this period of uncertainty with regards to the JCPOA, it's really important to consider what each of these regional states actually wants from Iran and what they're seeking from Iran. They all would like to be part of the regional discussions in some way. But when push comes to shove and you actually sort of press these policymakers as to, what the sort of demands are, what the sort of concessions they might make alongside Iranian ones, what sort of incentives they might offer Iranians as well in any kind of negotiation. There hasn't been, I think, a lot of a movement on the regional file. I think there are still a number of expectations on the Arab Gulf side that concessions will be zero sum from the Iranian side. And with that divide, it means, we have a bumpy year, if not road, ahead of us. And, we are going to be relying on the Biden administration and European policymakers to try to bridge these divisions and address these issues. So I'll stop here.
Great, thank you so much. All three of you brought up a number of topics, and there have been questions coming in already from the audience relating to what you said. For example, John, you raised this whole issue of software. Software is maybe the bigger issue than hardware, and I suppose that's where this one question is coming from, to an extent, from Paul Beaver, who asks, how sophisticated are the Gulf nations in cybersecurity and cyber attack? And I might actually add a bit here to myself. And what do they see in Israel a key element in sort of beefing up this cyber element, given that Israel seems to be quite advanced in this sort of cyber area, let's say. John, do you think you want to take this one?
Yes, I'll have a go at answering that. By no means am I a cyber expert, but I can talk about it in broad defense terms. So the future of the Gulf economies is digital, and that was a truth internalized some time ago by Bahrainis. And I can remember 5-6 years ago being at conferences with representations from the Gulf where they were already gearing up to not only creating that economy, but to defending it. I think what has happened, as we all know, is that the tempo and the penetrative power of cyber attacks has increased, and it's broadened too. So there's at the top end, you've got the state level adversities you need to worry about, but then, as anyone in business knows, you've got a whole host of other hostile actors to worry about too. So there's still a delta, and I'm sure that colleagues in the Gulf would agree with this, between what the aspiration is in terms of cyber defense and what they've actually got at the moment. There's also, I think, a genuine determination to close that gap. And it's interesting to see how prominently the generation of national cyber capabilities features in Vision 2030, for example. So I think that the offer, if you like, that Israel has got here is an interesting one, because it has, of course, deep and rapidly evolving expertise in this area. So it has maneuvered itself through an enterprise economy, through a deliberate fostering of technological innovation in this area. It maneuvered itself into a really leading position here. So that's obviously a very attractive offer. Sebastian was talking about collaboration that pre-exists these, of course. This has been an area under discussion. And it's going to be an area in which it will be relatively straightforward to make progress. I would make a point around this, however, is that one of the things that's so interesting about the Abraham Accords is that these are accords, interpret that how you like, between countries which have broad compatibilities. So if you look at the defense ecosystem in Israel and that in the UAE and that in Bahrain, they're not dissimilar. So there's an emphasis on high tech, there's an emphasis on high national involvement, there's, let alone the shared threats. There's a need for the highest level of defense against missiles and rocketry, so air defense is a priority. Now, what is interesting is that the previous treaties that Israel has had with Arab countries have not been between compatible economies. And this is one of the reasons why I can sense that there is a lot of scope for development of these relationships, and it will probably be outside of readily recognizable defense structures. But in some ways, that's how defense relationships are forged now. So you're inside each other's supply lines, your development cycle, your R&D cycle. There may equally be investment. I'm sure there will be movements of capital and FDI and commercial investment as well across the economy. So I think that's the kind of broader thing to look out for here, is how they realize the potential of the non-defense compatibilities, which will ultimately feed into, as is the way with modern defense, into supply chain capability development.
Great, thank you. Another question which has come up is from Richard Kaplan, who's at the University of Oxford. And he asks what the implication of normalization is for the question of Palestine. Now, we quickly touched upon this, but maybe we can dig a bit deeper on this one. Does anybody want to take this one in particular? Sebastian, maybe given that you brought up Palestine before, you were the first to mention it. So
of course, I can share my thoughts on that. Yes, I think when we look into the Gulf and how Palestine and the Palestinian conflict was perceived in the last couple of years and decades, and Sanam, you also mentioned the new generation of leaders. So I think there is a huge difference to shift away from this traditional narrative that solidarity with the Palestinians is one of the key pillars of legitimacy. So I think this has faded away, not completely, as I tried to lay out as I tried to outline for the Saudi case, but there is a discussion going on. If there is no progress on the Palestinian side to make concessions, to adapt to a new reality, etc. Why should we support them anymore? Of course, that is highly disputed in all of the Gulf societies, and there is also a trend that is going into the opposite direction. But it is a trend, and specifically in a generation that was not raised in a time of a very, very hot Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So when we look into the mid-30 or the mid-20 generation of Saudi Arabia or other countries, they were born into an era where the Islamic Republic was the most common threat for the last 2 or 3 decades. So therefore, Israel and also the Palestinian conflict is not 100% in their scope anymore. So it has become kind of a folklorist position, and therefore there is a more pragmatic stance, which is of course not in favor of a two-state solution, which is not in favor of the Palestinian cause, because some of my interlocutors said quite bluntly, okay, we need to look for security, we need to look for stability, we need to look for prosperity, and what does the Palestinian cause help us in that? So is it not maybe more relevant to deal with Israel in this field, and to reach out to Israel and to try to establish either formal or informal links with them on an economic, on a surveillance, on a cybersecurity level, because that is what we need at the moment. And as John said absolutely rightly, technical and digital advancement and maybe revolution in the Gulf is not only part of the security infrastructure they wanted to build up. It's also part of the I would say of a nationalistic rhetoric and part of a narrative that is spread out by most of the young leaders we have in the region, specifically in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia. So in this regard, I think specifically Saudi Arabia needs to continue officially its support for Palestine, and they will also try to incentivize maybe a more pragmatic stance from the Palestinian authorities by supporting them with development cooperation and humanitarian aid, as they did in the past. So to show them at least financial support. But when it comes to real politics, I think there is also this demand towards the Palestinians to move and to adapt to the new situation. And as long as this is not happening, or at the moment it's considered that this is not happening, then there is maybe also a lack of understanding why to support the Palestinian unconditionally by maybe missing chances that are in national interest.
Great, thank you. One question, which is maybe for you, Sanam, has come from Andre Nunes, and I hope I pronounced that halfway correct. He asks, or he says, the Sultanate of Oman, in a way, has a foreign policy very different from that of the other GCC countries in regard to Iran, it is, which basically seems to be more balanced. And in addition, Muscat has already received a visit from Israeli government officials. Is it possible to conjecture that Oman will soon also assume open diplomatic relations with Israel?
Thank you. That's an interesting point to consider. Yes, the Omanis have maintained those same similar relationships, perhaps even more overt than some of the other GCC states, as have the Qataris maintained ties with the Israelis as well. Oman is in a unique position, though, because interestingly, of course, when normalization was announced, I think there was quite a bit of pressure on Oman to join the Abraham Accords and be part of the normalization. And I think Oman's position is a bit more unique. They have domestic challenges that they have to consider. They have been through a very important succession, the passing of their longtime leader, Sultan Qaboos, and Sultan Haytham, who has taken the helm at a very difficult moment. Particularly with COVID, is, I think, prioritizing above all economic problems, which require the Omani government to, I think, very delicately manage the rebalancing of the Omani social contract. Imposition of VAT was just recently announced and so this is a huge shift for Oman. So I think this is part of the calculation. And interestingly, in Oman, there was opposition, actually a degree of opposition to normalization. And I think that was also taken into consideration. So I think the Omanis might join in, but they wouldn't want to compromise also their neutral relationship, the Switzerland of the Gulf, as they like to call themselves, position. And I wouldn't overstate their relations with Iran, but they have tried to maintain balance. And I would add to that, also with the Yemen war really on their doorstep, I think the priorities for the Omani government are local and to broaden the focus, particularly under the Trump administration, where ties were not as warm as they have been with other administrations. I think they were also, they felt quite isolated. President Trump never saw high-level Omani leaders, even on his trip to Riyadh, for example. When the Sultan died, the Americans sent a very low-level delegation to pay their respects. So I think also in the climate of U.S.-Omani relations, that's also worthwhile considering. Things might shift under the Biden administration, but Oman also, one final note, I think felt quite frustrated after the JCPOA was signed, because it took it played a very important role in bringing both the US and Iran together in a quiet back channel. And I think, privately, you'll hear people say that, that role didn't benefit them in any way. They felt quite marginalized by some of their GCC neighbors. And on top of it, they didn't win any favors from the Iranians at the same time. So I think this might have all impacted the Omani calculus.
Philip, if I may add something there to Dan's comment. I think it's a really interesting question whether or not Israel, as it were, wants to go for the whole set, whether it wants to collect every last potential signatory. I'm not so sure that it does, and we shouldn't be misled by that, because of course Israel has such a long and accomplished record in managing different sorts of relationships. It's deeply pragmatic about how it conducts relationships with other countries. And I think we'll see, definitely, there are some which will be a real prize for Israel. And I think Israel will work hard to bring those to a signature. But I think you'll also see a lot of other relationships that are sort of slightly unusual, short of open recognition, but increasingly close in certain areas. And the reason I say that is because what Israel has managed with the relationship with the UAE is he's got a fantastic bridgehead into the Gulf through Dubai, as well as politically through Bahrain and the UAE. So I think we'll see a kind of slow grow and a wide variety of relationships, rather than necessarily a sort of set of dominoes that all fall now.
May I add also one brief remark, because we did not touch upon Bahrain so much yet, and I think also Bahrain is a very interesting example for both Saudi Arabia and Israel. So of course for the Saudis, Bahrain is considered as the younger or the smaller brother. So there is a very close client patron relationship between both countries, economically, politically, in security terms, and therefore the normalization between Bahrain and Israel is also considered in Saudi Arabia as kind of a test balloon. So how will it go? And also it can be used and instrumentalized to reach out indirectly to Israel without having a public outcry or backlash that could happen if there would be a formal normalization. So in this regard, Bahrain is a very interesting role because interesting case because it's playing kind of a bridging role, and for both, for Israel and for Saudi Arabia. So therefore, maybe that also like limits the necessity for the Saudis to really go for normalization, because they have at least one foot in the door, maybe both, through Bahrain. And that is also that also needs to take into consideration when we look into the Saudi ambition, when and if a normalization should be realized.
Great, thank you. Those were fantastic points. One thing that I realized is that we talk a lot about let's say the Arab side of the Gulf and about Israel, but we mostly mentioned Iran sort of from the perspective of, let's say, the Gulf countries and talking about threat perception, etc. But maybe we could quickly talk about the Iranian view on this whole affair. On the one hand, were the Abraham Accords identified by Iran as a sort of serious threat, or not so much? And secondly, can we expect a sort of constructive Iranian approach to other partners in the Gulf before the election later this year, or do we basically just have to wait and see who's going to follow Hassan Rouhani? I don't know which one of you wants to take this one, or either of it.
I can start, and I'm sure John and Sebastian can sort of feed in. Where to begin? Well, I think the Iranians had a muted response to the Abraham Accords. They don't want to make it bigger than it really is. Of course, I think there is an alarm for them that the alignment will indeed lead to broader security coordination that will be much more overt. They definitely don't want to see that manifest. They definitely do not want to see Israel take a broader position in the Persian Gulf. And you will see, you might remember there was a statement made maybe about 10 days ago where Netanyahu accused the Iranians of sabotaging an Israeli ship that was near the straits, I think, of Hormuz. So the Iranians could be taking a proactive approach or sending messages. They're, quite concerned about Israel getting too close. And, this should be placed in the context of the number of incidents that have taken place inside Iran over the past year, from the sabotage at the Natanz facility in July of 2020 to the assassination attempt of Iran's nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. So, in the context of, internal dissent and sabotage, they wouldn't want to have the Gulf states be a launching pad for these further activities. In the same vein, I'm not sure that the UAE would want to make itself vulnerable as a launching pad in the same way. But of course, these sort of activities could very much heat up. The elections are, of course, an important issue. We don't know how they're going to play out. We will know in the next few weeks as candidates become clear. Iran continues, I think, quietly through back channels to try and reach out to the GCC, through the Kuwaitis above all. They are the interlocutor of choice for the Iranians, and, continue to try and push for some kind of dialogue. I think that for that dialogue to take place, the GCC would like to see some signs of goodwill from Iran, be that in Yemen, or be that in the region more broadly. And with missile and drone attacks coming from Yemen into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia at the rate they are, I don't think that we're moving into a period of conciliation or talks anytime soon. But Iran does have a relatively diverse set of relationships in the Gulf. There is no Gulf position on Iran. They do see Iran as a threat, but they manage Iran very in their own unique way. And this is where Iran is quite adept at sort of exploiting their bilateral relationships for better or worse. And the Qatar rift allowed Iran to develop warmer relations with Doha. And so the Qataris have, over the past few years, tried to mediate between the Trump administration and Iran. Today, they strongly state that return to the JCPOA is a first step forward. They're much more sympathetic to the case of maximum pressure and sanctions with regards to the Iranians. So, you can see divergent approaches within the GCC. And it's important, to consider how Iran manages and uses those to its benefit, and to break the GCC unity where it can.
Philip, I would add to Sanam's excellent points there. Just a couple of things. One is, it's a bit of a balance sheet, this, for the Iranians, and that it's not great news that your neighbors in the Gulf have just embraced Israel as a security body. It's just, on the face of it, that's not a good thing. But on that, I think they'll wait and see what this amounts to. And there's been a rhetorical response, of course, to this. But for all the reasons Sanam says, these are, the Israelis and the Gulf states have different approaches to Iran. They know that Israel won't be a straightforward partner to accommodate. So I think they're going to wait and see what it actually amounts to. I think their big concern is that Israel is a radicalizing partner, and that Israel moves the Gulf states to a more offensive posture. And there are flashpoints coming up for that. And those will be related to possibly politics inside Iran, but more likely to activities of Iran's network, including in Lebanon through Hezbollah, to which Israel feels it needs to respond, and it may well make requests of its new partners in the Gulf, which are really tricky requests to field. The other side of the balance sheet, of course, one of the things that's happened to sort of Sebastian's excellent point about on the Palestinians is that one by one, the Arab champions of the Palestinians have fallen away. And indeed, even the Arab sponsors of the Palestinians have fallen away. So who's left? So the person who's left, the state that's left, is Iran. And of course, Quds Force, for them, this is, rhetorically at least, this is really useful. So they've got, to strengthen their narrative of steadfastness in support of the Palestinian cause and so on and so forth. And they will make something of that. And it could translate into more activist support too. They have a strained relationship with Hamas, but it's been on as well as off in recent years. So I think they will, in summary, it's a balance sheet for them. They will wait out. The rhetoric will be characteristically hot from them on it.
Right, thank you. And indeed, Sanam, also thanks for mentioning Kuwait there, because just 5 minutes ago, there was a question from John Dunn here in Cambridge, who specifically said he's curious that no one has mentioned Kuwait so far. But since you did, you read his mind somehow and addressed the question without even knowing it. We are coming to the end of our hour. We have covered a lot. There's still some questions open, but I'm afraid we won't be able to address much more at this stage. More or less at the end now, but I thought maybe I could push you into, all three of you, into a sort of very short concluding thought. What do you think is the way forward here? If you can find a positive spin to this, by all means, but I won't push you into anything. Maybe if you could just have 1 or 2 sentences each, if you feel that you have a sort of good concluding thought.
If it's okay, I would start and try to give a rather optimistic outlook. So I think in the Gulf, there is an understanding that interventionist politics, ultranationalism, and trying to isolate the other following a zero-sum game is to some extent shifting. And I think the external pressure, the economic pressure, and also the experiences Gulf states have gained in the last couple of years, specifically during the Gulf Rift, have shown them that they maybe need to go another way. I think at the moment we see something in this direction going on in Saudi Arabia. So there is a more, at least from my understanding, there is a more pragmatic approach for several reasons, and that could take another hour to discuss this. But I think that could be a trend, hopefully, if that will play out in a regional integration in a security architecture that is inclusive. I don't think so. First and foremost, it will be more or less a reunification and close the ranks and files against Iran. But inside the Gulf, I think there is an understanding that everybody needs to live with each other if they like it or not. Because otherwise they will get weaker, and specifically under a Biden administration that is maybe not the security umbrella anymore, they need to look for other partnerships, and therefore hopefully there's more understanding for mutual cooperation in different terms, not only with regards to security, but also with regards to economy, with regards also to cultural exchange, people-to-people exchange, etc. And hopefully that could be kind of an optimistic outlook.
Great, thank you. That was good to hear on the hour mark, the optimistic spin to this or element of this. John or Sanam, any one of you want to come in with this?
Well, it's good to be optimistic, and I think that there is something quite remarkable about the Abraham Accords. I mean, this was an act of political courage and imagination. And however cynical you are about the motives in the contracting parties, it has changed something which 10, certainly 20 years ago, looked as though it could never be changed, which was the entrenched hostility of the Arab community towards the Israelis. So I think we should, per se, that's a great thing to embrace. But it's helping to set a new tone, as indeed are the generational reforms which Saudi Arabia, UAE, all the Gulf states are trying now to drive through. I think that Israel and its new partners have it within their powers to make each other both more secure and richer. So let's not forget the financial and commercial potential of the relationship too. And that we cannot but wish them well. I think the challenge in all of this, but let's stay positive, it's a challenge to which parties can rise, is first of all, how do you come up with something durable by way of security arrangements, architecture, call it what you will, which makes Iran no longer the adversary which shapes the agenda and dictates the pace of regional stabilization. I think that's the real challenge. A subsidiary challenge is, of course, as we talked about earlier, what now to be done about the Palestinians. But my hope would be that if you have a realignment in the Gulf, which includes Israel, it is possible to have these conversations with the same amount of imagination as the various parties have been talking about their own economies, their societies, and indeed the relationship with Israel.
I can also be positive about this. I do see the normalization as a hugely important shift, and strongly encourage more of these shifts that bring people together and sort of erase, these decades of hostilities and misunderstanding. So I very much hope that what we are seeing in terms of trade and tourism between the UAE and Israel in particular, will spread beyond those two countries into others around the region. I think that would be a hugely important sign. I see prospects actually for managing not just the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but perhaps a greater collaborative possibility with regards to the Syrian conflict as well. So, there are synergies there. And I should add that in terms of threat perceptions, we've spoken solely about Iran, but both countries do share similar threat perceptions with regards to Turkey. And, while tensions with regards to Turkey seem to be moderating slightly, probably as a result of the Biden administration, all this is a huge agenda for normalization. So, I would say that much of this, how all of this evolves, is really going to be driven partly by Washington and Washington's response and engagement with the region, how Washington manages, if it can even manage, to help shepherd through these de-escalation efforts in Yemen alongside all of the other conflicts. A hugely ambitious task while simultaneously also dealing with the JCPOA. If Washington is successful, the relationship could go into a very different direction, or it could be broadened. If Washington is not successful, we could see we could be having a different conversation in a year or two. So, you know, this is definitely an issue we have to keep following and talking about.
Well, thank you very much. What a point to end on, basically setting up the agenda for this webinar session 2 in a year's time. Invitation, sort of, let's mark it in our schedules. I think you know, I can only say congratulations to all three of you. You know, you really managed to look at this issue from so many angles, and you brought up so many fantastic points. Thank you very much from my end, and as I'm sure I speak for the audience more generally. It was really a fantastic ride through the region and its politics. This concludes the webinar. As I said at the beginning, recording of the event will soon be on our website. And on our website, you can also find many other events. And since last week, not only videos, but also podcasts. And indeed, only 2 days ago, we uploaded a new podcast episode on defiance and revolution in Iran, which relates so much to many of the things we discussed tonight. So I very much recommend you have a look at that as well. And on that note, I want to thank my panelists, or the panelists again. Thank you, the audience, and say goodbye.